Hello and welcome to the first inaugural episode of the College Football Fanatics podcast. I'm your host Dan. Um, this first episode is going to be a little messy just because it's the first episode, obviously, and I wasn't 100% prepared. So let's hop right into it. It is week 3 of college football, and we are currently looking at a dozen different schools, but we're only going to start off with 3 this week. So we're going to look at Michigan, Notre Dame, and Alabama. 3 very large programs, very, very important programs to the future of college football. Let's start off with my personal favorite, Michigan. Michigan football is one of the oldest programs in college football, and it has a really long history of quality football, but also of winning. And in the past 20 years, that winning tradition has not been the best in college football. We've lost to Ohio State 18 out of the past 20 years. Obviously, winning last year and winning once, and I believe 2012, I think, actually. My bad. But in the past 5 years, Michigan has gotten a lot better. They've won more games than they've lost, which is a good thing to say. So I want to start and look at the past 3 weeks for Michigan. So week 1, Michigan played. Who did they play? Sorry, week 1, Michigan played Hawaii. Michigan played Hawaii, and they looked pretty strong in that game. They had it was a oh sorry no Michigan played Hawaii week 2. We're gonna skip week 1 because that was 2 weeks ago, but Michigan played week 2, and this was the first start for JJ McCarthy, who is a sophomore. From the state of Illinois. He went to Nazareth Academy, and then he went to IMG Academy down in Florida for his senior year. JJ's first start this year was for Hawaii. He did not start at all last year. That was all taken up by Cade McNamara, who is a quality quarterback, but still has a few issues to work out. I love Cade. I think he's a good quarterback. I just think JJ is the better option for the Michigan offense. A few things that I noticed during the Hawaii game was that there was great pass protection from the offensive line. Every player in that offensive line looked like a star and will likely go on to play pro. There was an amazing running game from Blake Corum, who is the starting running back for Michigan this year, who's taking over for Hassan Haskins, who last year was the starting running back. He was backed up by Donovan Edwards and CJ Stokes, who CJ Stokes is a freshman this year. Donovan Edwards is going to be a sophomore. He is in the same class as JJ McCarthy. Blake Corum really looked like he will be the strongest point in this Michigan offense, with the exception of the pass game from JJ. In the past few games, JJ and Corum have turned this offense, who had a lot of questions in the offseason, into the top scoring offense in college football. They currently stand at number 1 in points per game. And overall, together, they just look like they're going to annihilate just about any defense that they come up against. Now, let's look at the opposite side of the ball. The opposite side of the ball last year had David Ajabo. It had Aiden Hutchinson, who were their starters on the offensive line. Now, those two players are in the NFL, and Hutchinson had a great game against Washington on Sunday, and he looks like he'll be in the pros for quite a while. But um, Michigan lost those two players, and with those two players, they lost 25 sacks. So they're going to have to look to create more pressure on quarterbacks with the offensive line in its entirety, and that looks like it's not going to be a problem, but they're still going to need more players on the line than they did last year. They used a lot of blitzes and odd man rushes to attack Hawaii's offensive line in that game, and they were getting through pretty easily. They were able to cut through Hawaii's offensive line like a hot knife in butter. But with Hawaii, that isn't saying much. Let's talk about Hawaii for a second. Hawaii lost against Vanderbilt by I think some 30 odd points. And Vanderbilt is not the SEC's best team. Vanderbilt, I believe, is the bottom of the SEC right now. And I believe Hawaii is the worst team in college football at the moment. So it's not really saying much that a defensive line can get through Hawaii. But nonetheless, they looked pretty good from their starters. Those starters including Mozzie Smith, who is Michigan's defensive tackle and looks to be a pretty big freak of nature right there. He's looking to really up his draft stock. He did not play a ton last season. I think he got some play time in all of his games, but it wasn't all that notable considering that Hutchinson and Jabo was just stealing away the show from everybody. I mean, the two names you heard on broadcasts all last year the most was David Ajabo and Aiden Hutchinson. Those were just the two greatest names on that Michigan football team. Michigan looks to have improved in the secondary by quite a bit. They brought in a lot of really good recruits this year, or last year, I should say. And they look to have filled a few holes that were not glaring, but when it was obvious enough to see that there was some fixing needing to be done there. So they've brought in Will Johnson, who is a freshman as well. He looks to be really, really good. I expect some really great things out of him. And they also switched a wide receiver from their position to the other side of the ball in a defensive back. They switched Mike Sanderstill, who was a pretty good receiver last year, making a bunch of catches, but he wanted to switch and play both ways, do a little Charles Woodson style of playing and play both receiver and defensive back. And he seems to be filling in that defensive back position really nicely. One of the things that I really did notice against Hawaii was there were several drops by receivers. Now against UConn, which was last Saturday's game, those for the most part seemed to have gone away. But there were still drops that needed to be fixed. Cornelius Johnson, I believe, had a drop. He also had a couple of drops in week 1, I think. And that was the biggest thing that I saw that needed to be fixed. Now let's talk about UConn. Michigan looked very, very good against UConn in the first half. UConn could barely move the ball. I think they got 16 yards in the whole first half, both passing and rushing. I believe that they only had 16 yards. Blake Corum had 4 touchdowns in the first half for a total of 5 touchdowns, tying the school record for the most touchdowns with last year's Hassan Haskins against Ohio State. So these two guys tying with a player that played back in the 60s are the only players in Michigan football to have rushed for 5 touchdowns um, in a game. Michigan in the second half looked a bit disorganized. They looked like they were just struggling to move the ball in the first few drives, I should say. And the defense was giving up bigger yardage than they were in the first half. Now that can just be credit to UConn changing up their style of play enough to throw Michigan's defense off balance, but it could also just be Michigan being Michigan and showing signs of problems. And as a Michigan fan, I have lived through a dozen years where Michigan looked like they were going to be decent that year, where they might go, 8-6 or 8-4, I should say. Sorry, not 8-6, 8-4, or 10-2, and they just ended up going 6-6, and you're like, what went wrong? And it's because they just sucked. And while I am still optimistic about this season, even losing everything that Michigan lost from their team last year, a lot of their leaders, I still think that they're going to look very, very good, but I can't help but wonder if those problems are going to start to creep up once you get into weeks 7, 8, 9, when they're playing slightly tougher opponents, and especially when Michigan goes on the road to Columbus this year and plays Ohio State, which is always a tough game, and it's even tougher in Columbus. Cade McNamara actually got hurt at the end of the first half. He took a few shots. He is unlikely to show his face in the next few games. There's a leg injury. There's been a few videos of him with a brace on his knee, so we'll see what John Harbaugh has to say with that going on. Let's talk about some stat rankings this year for football. It's only week 3, so these don't mean as much as I would like them to, and I wish that they meant more. But I love the different times in the college football season for different reasons. I love the beginning of the season because you have the optimism, and you also have the who knows what's going to happen. Nobody's played a competitive down of football for the past 7 months, and now it's what does the offseason represent? Who has improved? Who has gotten worse? Gotten worse is obviously Notre Dame, but we'll talk about them in just a few minutes. So let's go back to the stat rankings. Michigan is currently number 1 in points per game. They haven't really played anybody of worth, so it's not really that big of a deal, but still nice to see that number 1 in that column. They are tied for 3rd in defensive points per game, so giving up the least amount of points. They've only gave up 5.67 points per game, which is, again, they haven't really played anybody, so that doesn't really matter all that much. JJ McCarthy took over for Cade McNamara after the first game of the season. He has since been named the starter. He currently has a a completion percentage of 88.2%, and he is the highest rated quarterback in college football. There is he has 20 there's Michigan has 277 passing yards per game, which is tied for 47th overall, and 31.3 rushing yards per game, tied for 17th overall, obviously led by the duo of Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards. So we've talked about Michigan. Let's now move on and talk about Notre Dame. Now, the game that I want to highlight with Notre Dame is not the Notre Dame Ohio State game that they played, which is it's a tough game. It's not an easy game that's going on, and Ohio State won that game 21-10. The game that I actually want to talk about is Notre Dame Marshall. Now, I've been a Marshall fan as well for probably 12 years. I've followed them almost as closely as I follow Michigan. I am a huge fan of the Marshall program. There's a lot of history there. There's some really sad history as well in the 70s. But Marshall and Notre Dame played a couple weeks ago, and Marshall won this game by a pretty convincing fashion. If you watch the game, it looked like Notre Dame was nearly standing still next to Marshall. It was kind of it was a surprising game. I did not think that Marshall was going to win, considering that Notre Dame was, to start off the season, ranked, I believe, fifth. I believe in the AP poll in week 1, they were ranked fifth, and they have all of the talent to play to that level. I thought that they were going to make a possible run at a college football playoff this year. I had them. I had predicted that they were going to win 11 games, dropping only one game. They didn't. They don't have very many easy games this season on their schedule, but I did not think that they were going to be beaten by Marshall, which was a really, really big shock. So Marshall in this game, the offensive line really held its own against Notre Dame's defensive line. I thought that an offensive line that is not as big as the defensive line would lose, but they didn't, and they held their own, and they really, really kept up really well. This is the first ever meeting between Marshall and Notre Dame. So Marshall's obviously 1-0 and undefeated against Notre Dame. Marshall in this game ran a lot of bubble and bubble screen plays, and it worked really, really, really surprisingly well. I was pretty shocked that every time they ran a screenplay, they got like 5 to 10 yards out of it, and they just kept moving the ball. So Marshall's quarterback, Columby, I can't remember his first name, and I don't actually have it written down. Looked really good. He was accurate. He got out of the pocket when he needed to when Notre Dame's defensive line was pressuring him. He threw a lot of really solid passes downfield when they needed a pickup on third down, and it overall was just a great game for him. He just looked really, really well. Now, Notre Dame also played Ohio State, and they lost that game as well, 21-10. They lost 21-10, and they really there was a lot of issues in that game that I saw for Notre Dame, but I also saw a few issues for um, Ohio State. Ohio State at times could not move the ball against a Notre Dame defense that seems to be very, very inconsistent in how well they are able to stop both running backs and passing plays. But one of the things that I saw for Ohio State, which really pains me to say, is Travion Henderson, Notre Dame's not Notre Dame, Ohio State's starting running back, looked very, very good um, in that game. Um, I would not be surprised if Travion Henderson gets 1,000 rushing yards this season, even though I would classify Ohio State as a primarily pass oriented team. I think that they will usually pass when they can, but run the ball when they have to. But Travion Henderson is one of those players that can make what looks to be a 2-yard run and turn it into a 5-10 out throughout the game. A fairly high powered Notre Dame defense or Notre Dame offense. Um, and although I haven't seen too much of Notre Dame, I only watched snippets of their game this past week. They did win this past week, so it's they're starting off their season. They're not going to be running for a college football playoff spot this season. But I also don't think that they're going to end up being 6-6, which was in the first when I looked at their first 3 losses, I was quite worried that they actually would. So moving on from Notre Dame, I want to talk about a huge game that was played back in week 2. I believe it was week 2. And it was Texas and Alabama. Now, this was a game that surprised a lot of people. I don't think Texas was ranked at this point, and I think Alabama was ranked number 1. And Texas almost won against Alabama. It was a last minute field goal that saved Alabama from a loss. And that is a major point because I did not think that Texas was going to be as good as it looked this season. I thought that they were too young and that they didn't have enough offensive weapons to run a high powered offense. But what really surprised me was not that their offense does look to be quite high powered, but that their defensive line looked really well. They were getting through, Texas's defensive line was really getting through Alabama's offensive line when it really counted on third downs and other meaningful plays where it was they might be backed up in their own 20 and they need to stop and they stop Alabama. It really looked quite phenomenal to watch their defensive line go against what some consider as the best offensive line in college football. I would rank Michigan and Ohio State's offensive lines above Alabama's, but there is some disagreement there amongst bigger fans of college football. Alabama had a ton of penalties. I believe that they had like 105 yards or something like that of penalties. Oh, I know they had over 100 yards, which is really, really bad. Most of those penalties came on defense. Will Anderson, who is a Heisman hopeful, and definitely a um, quality defensive lineman, uh, had a lot of issues with false starts in that game. I mean, he could not keep his eye on the ball and move when he was supposed to save his life, it seemed like. And watching Nick Saban on the sideline just lose his mind was oddly um, oddly amusing. Um, Quinn Ewers, the quarterback for Texas, he looked really, really good until he was injured in, I believe it's the second quarter. It was either the end of the first or beginning of the second quarter. Um, a an Alabama player came up and kind of just picked him up and basically threw him on the ground and landed on top of him and injured his shoulder. So I believe he's going to be missing about 6 to 8 weeks. I think the estimate was, which is going to be a very big part of Texas's offense missing. Um, they will be looking they'll be missing him quite a lot. But the backup card, I can't remember his first name either, proved to be a really, really solid backup quarterback. I honestly think if he went to most other schools, he would be a starter. If he went to some of the schools that I think that I'm thinking of right now might be some of the lower end Big Ten or SEC schools, like Missouri or something like that. He would almost definitely be a starter there. Um, he really proved himself against a Bama defense that looks pretty good. He was able to move the ball well. He got out of the pocket when he needed to. Um, he really was able to find Xavier Worthy um, pretty pretty often for a great um, receiving receiving play receiver for some great pickups for games. Uh, I boil this down to who played the best defense. Um, it was basically just a defensive slugfest of can you move the ball enough to win? But there was no there really was no team that I think looked I mean, Texas looks spectacular, but I think that's partially because I came into the game not thinking too much of them, and Alabama looked not great, but I think that's also because I came into the game thinking, they're number one, they've been playing really well, and they should at least play well in this game. They did play well, but they didn't play as well as I had thought they would. Now let's look at the offensive side of the ball for Alabama. Bryce Young, a Heisman winner and another and a hopeful for a second Heisman Trophy, played great. That's there's not a lot that you can say otherwise. He played very well, but at times he seemed like he was a little slow to release the ball. There was a point in the game where they were backed up to Alabama was backed up to their like 3 yard line or something like that. He took the snap and he was in the end zone, and it really looked like Texas was going to sack him for a safety, and he barely got the ball out of his hands on time. Um, but it's just nobody was really getting open. His receivers were not helping him all that well. There were a few drops and a few missed catches that should have been caught that were not. Um, the one big thing that I do want to say that is good for Alabama is they made a late game push that shows that Bryce Young does have a lot of leadership out there, that he can get his guys in, and keep them in line enough to win the game and hang on and get that final field goal. And the game literally went down to the last and final second. And because of that, because of um, his leadership ability, he was able to salvage a win from this game. Um, and I think the biggest takeaways is that I don't think this hurt Bryce Young's Heisman um, chances for a second one this year, but I also don't think that it helped him too much, with the exception of gathering together his team to make that late game push. All right, so Ohio State played Toledo um, this past Saturday, and I was quite surprised with how well Toledo played in the first half. More in the first quarter, but in the first half they played pretty well as well. So I'll put that all together. Um, Toledo's quarterback, I think, truly could play just about anywhere in the country, if he wanted to. Um, he scrambled a lot because his offensive line couldn't match up against the Ohio State defensive line. I believe he had 70 rushing yards on the game. So he had to scramble quite a few times. He did get sacked a few times as well, but he was accurate on the run. When he needed to throw it, he was extremely accurate. He showed off his arm strength with their first touchdown. Um, he looked really well. He looked really good for a Toledo quarterback. And Ohio State obviously won the game 77-21, I believe was the final score. Um, CJ Stroud took the game into his own hands. I mean, he had, I think, nearly 400 yards passing in the entire game, and he looked quite he looked like he could also make a run for Heisman as well, um, making Bryce Young look pretty pretty um, pretty pedestrian, I guess you could say. He made him look like he was playing high school ball compared to what CJ Stroud was doing. I mean, CJ Stroud was throwing balls into really tight windows on the run quite accurately, and it was impressive to watch him um, play that game, to say the least. I already talked about Travion Henderson not being surprised if he were to lead the team in rushing yards. I won't be surprised leads if he leads the Big Ten, maybe even the nation. I don't think that they'll give him the ball enough to truly utilize him. I think that a school like Michigan will will run the ball a lot more often than Ohio State will. But I would still keep an eye out on Travion Henderson's um, running athleticism. He'll likely, in my opinion, go to the pros as well, and probably be a um, pretty great football player, and pretty great running back for whatever team decides to um, pick him up. Um, Ohio State's defense looked really tough, and really, really strong. They pushed around the Toledo offensive line almost like it was nothing. Um, it was impressive to see their defensive ends get by um, the 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 Toledo's offensive tackles pretty easily. Um, Again, Toledo's quarterback took a few sacks, and he had to scramble his way out of a bunch of bad places and a bunch of bad spots, and it just did not look good for Toledo's. Um, it did not look good for Toledo's offensive line, and I'm sure that they will be working um, pretty heavily throughout the rest of this weekend to get ready for their game next weekend. In other news, a few weeks ago, there was a big news drop that the college football playoff will be expanded to a 12 team setup. Now, this is going to be it's going to be interesting to see um, how the playoff committee decides to go this route. I think that they'll probably end up um, giving the top two teams a bye week, and then the next 10 teams will match up and they'll play each other, and then in the end, and then they'll go on from there and do two teams against each other. But that is huge news. This is a big topic about a lot of people come down really differently. A lot of people hate the idea of an expansion. Um, a lot of people think it's just an idea to get a lot of money. It's an idea to not do to just get more money back in college football. And while it probably is a way to get more money, I think it's actually a great idea because I think it involves more teams and it gives more teams the opportunity to make it to that national championship game, and it allows teams who previously might not have um, shown shown their full potential the chance to show their full potential. Um, and this is seemingly self-serving because I hope Michigan will stay in the top 10 for quite a while, and if they do, they'll probably end up being in that playoff, in that 12 team playoff. But that 12 team playoff, the date, the year that it said it was going to be enforced was 2026. Although I have heard rumors that they're looking to move that up into 2024 instead. Um, I don't think that they can do it any earlier than that. I think that there's just going to be too much contract negotiation with television companies and things like that to really put it next year or even at the end of this year. And let's see. Georgia. Georgia is going to be the last team that I am talking about today. Georgia looks to be the team to beat in college football this year. Last year they had probably one of the best defenses college football has ever seen. They had something like 7 or 8 first round picks and another, I think, 2 or 3 second round picks in their defense, and that's just talking about players who entered the draft and not even about players who either decide to stay or couldn't enter the draft based on eligibility. And I was watching Georgia's. I've been watching Georgia progressively throughout the season. I haven't watched one of their games entirely. Um, Last weekend they played against South Carolina. Um, they looked really, really strong. They did not seem to be losing a step from last year's team. They looked like they're going to be a hard team to beat. I don't think Alabama is going to be able to beat Georgia this year. I just, even with Bryce Young and all of Alabama's talent that they obviously have, I think Georgia is just going to be way too strong for them. Um, their their defense just looked big and strong and fast, and the offense didn't look much weaker. They really, really showed up, and they just put on a show against just about every team that they've played this season. And it'll be interesting to see what happens next year, or next week. So thanks for listening. This is the College Football Fanatics podcast. I am on here. I'm Dan, your host. I'm going to be on here 11 o'clock every Wednesday. So tune in to watch us again, and have a great day.